Okay, I'm genuinely delighted to introduce Trevor Millar. I've known Trevor for several years, and he has been a very, very important, I guess you could even say essential, component of the work with Iboga in particular and Iboga in this area. He's the owner of Liberty Root Therapy, yes, which has been doing fantastic work in addiction treatment primarily, based in White Rock, right here, not far from Vancouver. So Trevor is another one of these leading edge people who's doing fantastic work. And so please give him a big welcome.
Thank you, Stephen. Hello, everybody. I'm a little too much gratitude before I have to speak. I had to tone things down there for a second, but I'm here to give you kind of a 101 on Iboga and Ibogaine. A word of warning, first of all, though, when the nice lady at the psychedelic conference gives you a chocolate in the morning, read the label. I was sitting here after lunch, and I'm like, man, I feel high. I feel like I microdosed or something. And my friend goes, did you have one of those chocolates? I'm like, no, the chocolates? She's like, read the label next time. Anyway, I've come down a bit, which is good. Really. So Iboga, Ibogaine, it comes from Africa, a shrub in Africa, which is called Tabernanthe iboga, and there are other plants with ibogaine in it as well. Volcanga africana is one of those. And the tale is, in the traditional context, is that a porcupine was eating something. A hunter shot that used an arrow or something to kill that porcupine, went home, his wife cooked it up, and they got very high. It's a powerful psychedelic. It leads to generally about a 36-hour-long trip, and apparently that is how Iboga was discovered, and that was through the Pygmy tribes in Africa. And then the legend is that the Pygmy tribes in Africa then brought the Iboga to the people who became the Bwiti tradition. And the Bwiti tradition is mostly in Gabon, but it's all over West Africa as well. And I don't know too much specifically about the Bwiti tradition. I am planning on going to Africa in July and visiting a whole bunch of villages then. But I have experienced this medicine in a kind of westernized Bwiti context. There are some people working with Iboga in that Bwiti context here in BC, actually, and they do really great work. But when I spoke to my friend Mark this morning, actually, and just said, so what are some of those great things that you say about Bwiti again? And he said, Bwiti means a study of life. And one of the great things that I heard him say when I was working with him is, in the Bwiti tradition, everything that you could ever want comes from life. And everything that you could ever need comes from life. But you also are life. So therefore, you've got those answers within you. So in the traditional context, they will use the medicine for initiation into adulthood. They'll use the medicine for whatever ails them. It's done in a ceremonial context. When they do initiate people, it can take a week. It is root bark, so it's the second layer of root bark that's used as the actual medicine. So when you do it in that traditional context, it's like eating a lot of very acrid sawdust. I'm a bit nervous about going to Africa. That's the one thing that frightens me, is the taste of Iboga frightens me. I'll drink ayahuasca all day compared to eating this stuff, so I'm just not sure I can stomach it. I've heard rumors that if you can't stomach it, they'll get it in you other ways. So I hope I don't have to discover that. Yeah, so I encourage people to really look into that traditional Bwiti way of using the medicine. And if you do get a chance to go to Africa, I encourage that as well. This trip that I'm going on in July, I believe anybody can go. So if you'd like information on that, you can let me know. And then in the 1960s, a really big heroin addict, a 19-year-old heroin addict by the name of Howard Lotsoff, in 1962, New York City, his chemist buddy, and I heard this from his wife, Norma, his chemist buddy knew that he would try anything. He said, "Hey, Howard, try this Ibogaine stuff." He said, "All right, I'll try it." He'd try anything. So he did this on his way to his psychologist's couch, and he spent the next couple of days on his psychologist's couch. But he came out the other end, and he's like, "Wait a second. I haven't wanted heroin the whole time that I've been on this, nor do I want it now." And that's remarkable because in the face of this opioid epidemic, and I've been working with opioid addicts for the last 4 years. Opioid addiction and other addictions, they're a lot different. The opioid addiction is very physically addictive. So if you don't get that opiate, your whole body, right now our bodies are pumping endorphins, which are our body's natural opiate. But when you take that opiate from external sources for long enough, your own body shuts down that system. So just our painkillers, there's a certain pain that gravity brings us. There's a certain pain to living, which is, we don't even recognize it. But if you take away our pain-killing chemicals, all of a sudden you're in agony. So to stop heroin addiction or any opioid addiction, it's not, why don't you just stop? It's, if you're going to stop, you've got 6 or 7 days of dire hell that you're going to face, followed by months and months of post-acute withdrawal symptoms. So all of a sudden, when Howard, being a heroin addict, feels no withdrawal and no desire for opiates anymore, that's a really big deal. So thank goodness Howard was very industrious, and he got the word out. He was knocking on doctors' doors for years saying, "I have found a cure to addiction. You really need to look at this." And he started something called the Global Ibogaine Therapy Alliance, which is still in existence. I'm currently actually the acting director of that. And they came out with a standards manual. And that's the other thing with Iboga, and one of the reasons why it's a bit of a dark horse, is it's the psychedelic that can kill you. There are potential cardiac risks. So when we work with clients through Liberty Route, we do a lot of screening beforehand. You must get an ECG done. You must get blood work done. And all of the dangerous aspects of Iboga are preventable. And through these guidelines, nobody should be dying from this medicine. There has been enough published that gives you the right ways of working with this medicine. And thankfully, Howard was able to do that. So with Howard's kind of evangelization of Iboga, clinics opened up around the world. It is illegal in the United States. It's legal here in Canada. I'll get a bit more into Canada in a second. But clinics opened up around the world. There's clinics in Mexico, in New Zealand, like in Canada. It's on the prescription drug list in New Zealand. So, many years and many, many treatments have gone by. Iboga seems to have anywhere from, depending on when I do the count personally out of my clinic, it seems to be anywhere from about 65 to 75% success rate treating hardcore opiate addiction. And it does work for other addictions as well. It's, alcohol, you need to detox before you go into a treatment, whereas with opioids, you can stay on opioids right up until the time that you go into the treatment. Crystal meth, it works brilliantly for crystal meth. I see a 100% success rate for crystal meth out of the clients that I've seen come through. Thanks. There's only, there's a dozen clients that have come through, but with a low dose of medicine as well, it's incredible what happens with crystal meth. So yeah, lots of clinics around the world. Within Canada, The first person that I know about working with it in Canada was Mark Emery, who is probably well known to many people in this room. He started Cannabis Culture and has been a big advocate for a lot of different things, including the medical use of cannabis. But he started treating people for free in Vancouver with the money he'd made in other ventures. And that went on for a couple of years, as far as I know. Then the Iboga Therapy House opened up on the Sunshine Coast in BC. That operated for 4 or 5 years. Then there was a bit of a dry spell, and then we opened Liberty Root, and then some other clinics have opened up in Vancouver as well, or just north of Vancouver. So the legalities in Canada, it was a natural health product. It was on the list of natural health products, which, in speaking to somebody who knows somebody at Health Canada, basically when they came out with that natural health product list, they went around the world, looked for any kind of thing like ginkgo biloba, rhodiola, anything they could find to put on this list, they put on this list. And Iboga went on that list with it. And that wasn't the best space for it, because a natural health product should be available over the counter, and it should be something that there's not a lot of risk in taking. And as I said, there is potential risk with Iboga. It's in May, they just put it on the prescription drug list. So over the 4 years that I've been working with this medicine, I've actually had many interactions with Health Canada. They're all awesome. I've had, nothing but amazing people who really want to do a great job and are curious about what I'm doing, and took some time to research what we were up to before calling me, and have had great relationship with them. But what they did in May is put it on the prescription drug list, which is where it should be, because it is potentially dangerous. Unfortunately, as with it on the prescription drug list, that doesn't mean we can just walk into PharmaSave and pick up Iboga, even if your doctor prescribes it. It still needs to go through clinical trials, which then will allow Iboga to have the drug identifier number, which then means it would be available through the pharmacy. I personally closed Liberty Root down in May after about 4 years. I just needed to take some time off. We had an adverse event. Somebody in August came to Liberty Root and they forged the EKG that they sent me, because he knew he had a bad heart, but a 20-year heroin addiction, he was desperate to stop. It almost killed him. He ended up in the hospital for a week, in a coma for a week, in the hospital for 6 weeks. And now he's more than 2 years clean. So he's happy, his family's happy with how it all went. But I seem to picked up a slight bit of PTSD over those 6 weeks. So I found I wasn't quite as clinical as I had been able to be throughout the years previous. So we decided to close the operation. And so what are we going to do moving forward? We're moving forward with a couple of angles. Number one, I'm really focused on trying to get the clinical trials that Iboga needs and deserves done. These clinical trials aren't going to prove anything to me. I know this stuff works. I see it work again and again. It's 100% effective in detoxing opiate addicts. And, of course, people have decisions to make once they leave my facility, but I don't let them leave unless I see that they're 100% detox. And I don't think there's any other thing on earth that does that for an opioid addict. So working towards clinical trials. At the same time, Canada has something called the Special Access Drug Program, which we're going to use that avenue to see if we can get access and permission to use the medicine in Canada now as well. The root bark itself is not scheduled as far as I know. I heard that through a friend of a friend, but the friend was Dennis McKenna, so he probably knows who to talk to about that. But the root bark itself is not scheduled at all. 10 minutes? Cool. Well, the experience itself, I myself have had 4 large doses of Iboga over the years. I try and do it at least once a year. The experience is called oniric. So oniric means as related to dreams. So it's not very exciting to watch, as far as me working, it's somebody lying in bed. We do have a registered nurse that we bring in whenever we do the flood dose. One of those registered nurses is in the room. And We have a doctor that works with us. She was able to prescribe morphine and things like that leading in, so we didn't have to rush into giving Ibogaine treatment. But the experience, as related to dreams, so people tend to see, dream-like hallucinations. It's a lot different than anything else. It's different than ayahuasca, but related chemically slightly. It's still a tryptamine. I heard Dimitri, who's one of kind of the rock stars in the Iboga world. It was an event like this. A movie had just came out that he was featured in called Dangerous with Love. And somebody in the room said, what's the difference between Iboga and ayahuasca, for example? And he said, well, I've had ayahuasca, I think 16 or 17 times. I've had Iboga plenty of times. And he said, Iboga is a root. It's rooty. It's ancestry. We go back into the past. We dig deep into the holistic aspect of what this earth means and how we are related to that. And he said, ayahuasca, it's from outer space. And I think that really rings true, having tried both of those medicines numerous times. Ayahuasca has the ability to take you very far out and give you incredible lessons that you then need to come home and do hard work to integrate. And I find that Iboga, out of all the psychedelics that I've worked with, it really does seem to have this added integrative piece that, it's so powerful that it can help somebody stop heroin addiction. Biologically, what's happening apparently is the ibogaine, once you take it, it gets turned into noribogaine, which then, like THC, gets stored in your fat cells for quite a while. So it slowly releases over the course of the next couple of months and really puts people on a bit of a pink cloud where, that's a great opportunity to make sure that your life is in order. So we do a lot of work before our clients come to us to kind of prepare them and get that aftercare strategy in place. And then hopefully they run with that aftercare strategy. But at the same time, I've treated people without any aftercare strategy. And, that was kind of more in our early days, but they still see success. So, sometimes people put all this effort into an aftercare strategy and they might relapse, whereas somebody who doesn't do anything, they still see success. So I'm always looking for that special sauce. What is it that will make each treatment stick? And there's a lot of ingredients to that special sauce, I think. I think I can probably take a few questions if anybody would like any. Before I do that, I'll just quickly share a personal story about the last large dose of medicine that I took, which was in May of last year. I took it in this Bwiti context. My friend had worked with this medicine and been to Africa and been trained in that way, and he wanted me to try it his way. I said, sure, and went up to Squamish where he was working at the time and had this experience. And in the way he works with it is he has you write out 10 questions that you'd like to ask the medicine. And I knew it was an ancestor medicine, so I said I'd like to see my grandma and grandpa. And I wrote a few other questions. And then the way he answered those questions is kind of when you're at your peak, he comes down and takes you through almost a visualization exercise that leads you through all of these questions. So at one point he said, all right, now go find your grandma and grandpa. And he apologized after. He normally would have done grandma, then grandpa, but he said grandma and grandpa. So I got to grandma, and she's all the unconditional love that she always was, and it was wonderful. And he was kind of pulling me away to the next activity, as it were, in the visualization exercise. And my grandpa's energy, he was a World War II vet. He was an alcoholic for most of his life. He wasn't a brutal drunk by any means, but was suffering PTSD, as we call it now, from World War II, and didn't know how to deal with that. So he drank a case of beer every night. And it really affected my mother, and my mother would always say, don't do that, you'll get addicted. Don't do that, you'll get addicted, which turned addiction into this forbidden fruit I needed to figure out, which I'm sure has led me into my current career. But my grandpa's energy out of nowhere just stepped forth in such a powerful way. And he said, Trevor, you need to stop drinking for my lineage. Like, whoa. So that was that. And then a next part of an exercise was, Mark said, go into your front yard. And he said, are there any trees there? I said, yes, there's I lived at this beautiful house in White Rock at the time with this gorgeous cherry tree, and it was the time of the year that this cherry tree was flowering. So it was this big pink flowery tree. And he said, go up to that tree and give it a hug. So I gave the tree a hug. And he said, ask that tree what the purpose of life is. I'm like, tree, what's the purpose of life? And the tree said, to flower. I'm like, awesome. That makes a lot of sense. So then he said, and I can't remember the exact terminology of the question, but it was a question around how to get rid of negative tendencies in your life, how to get rid of that crap that you're carrying. And the tree said, stop watering your weeds. Like, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And, kind of in conjunction with what my grandfather had just said, I saw that drinking for me, I was probably, I was never a truly problematic drinker, but I wasn't hungover necessarily every morning, but maybe I wasn't as happy as I would have been if I hadn't had that bottle of wine. So I woke up the next morning or stood up the next morning. It's not like you get much sleep. And spoke to Mark and said, yeah, all this stuff came up around drinking. And he said, there's an argument. He had quit drinking a couple of years before because he had a problematic relationship with it. But he said, there's an argument to be made that because of the nature of the work we've chosen, we may need to hold ourselves to a bit of a standard. And I'm like, yeah, that's fair. So maybe I'll stop drinking. So I drove home the next day, and on my way home, I had this incredible urge to go to the pub that I always went to and flirt with the girls I always flirted with and have a couple beers. And I called Mark, thankfully. He said, I'm dying for a beer here. He said, well, maybe you don't have to stop forever, but maybe at least today. And, while that medicine's in your system, I'm like, yeah, all right, I'll just go home. So I went home, I went to bed, and I woke up, and I haven't wanted to drink since. The desire completely fell away, and it's still like that. So on a final note, before probably the one question we'll be able to fit in, I please hope that you all find a way to stop watering your weeds so that you can all flower. Thanks. There was one question for sure.
Oh, excuse me, we're recording this. Could you come and stand at the mic here? Thanks.
Do you get the same results with methadone addiction as you do with heroin?
No. So that's a great question. So methadone prolongs the QT interval of the heart, and that's essentially the space in between heartbeats. Ibogaine also prolongs the QT interval of the heart. So too much space in between the heartbeats is hugely problematic. Ask any dead person. So what we used to say is we needed somebody to come off of methadone for at least 10 days prior to an Ibogaine treatment. And methadone has a certain stickiness to it as well. So I would actually tell my clients after years of working with this that you actually need a month off. So that would mean switching to a short-acting opiate, which isn't the best thing to do to somebody that's been using methadone for a while. There's a certain stability that can come from using methadone. So that's the old protocol, but there's a very cool protocol that Andrea from iSeers is working with Claire Wilkins from Pangea Biomedicals, who's a mentor of mine, a great Ibogaine provider, and they have this awesome protocol where you just go in once a week. You go in a bit of withdrawals so that your receptors are open and waiting to receive something. Take a small dose of Ibogaine, just enough that you're barely going to feel it. You stay in the hospital or wherever the treatment's happening for about 4 or 5 hours, and then you go home. And then when you need methadone again, when you feel that need, you only take half as much. So you can do that once a week and walk people off methadone in this really non-invasive way. It's a dreamy protocol. I helped a friend with it recently, and he just walked off, slept that night, feels like $1 million. So I think we're gonna see a lot more of protocols like that, because the big dose of Ibogaine is very hard on the system, but we can do a lot with a little medicine.
And for someone who's been using methadone for 25 years?
Yeah, it's sticky stuff. Like I said, it's not going to be easy. As one of my first clients said, there's no such thing as a biological free ride. You've got to pay for all this pleasure that you've been hijacking all these years. But the cool thing with Ibogaine is you pay the piper and your debt's actually settled afterwards. So, but I'd be happy to work with somebody who's been on methadone for that long with that protocol. Thank you. Thanks, everybody.